Have you ever wondered how a simple piece of paper signed by diplomats can cripple an entire nation's economy? It's not bombs or troops this time, but sanctions. Sanctions that freeze billions in overseas assets, cut off vital oil exports, or even block access to international banking systems. In today's world, economic pressure is often more devastating than military conflict. But who decides what's fair? And when does legality give way to geopolitics? Stay with me, because in this story, we're going to unpack the real power behind international sanctions, the countries that wield them, and the legal tightrope they walk. Let's rewind to 1945. The world had just emerged from the wreckage of World War II. To prevent such devastation from recurring, the United Nations Charter was born, promising international cooperation and peace. Chapter 7 of the Charter introduced a concept that would change the nature of global power: collective measures. This gave the UN Security Council the authority to impose sanctions against any state posing a threat to peace. In theory, it sounded straightforward. But fast forward to today, and sanctions have morphed into a complex, often controversial instrument of power. Take the case of Iran. In 2015, after years of escalating tensions over its nuclear program, Iran agreed to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, with world powers. In return for limits on uranium enrichment, sanctions were lifted. But then came 2018, when the United States under President Trump unilaterally exited the deal and reimposed sanctions. Billions in oil revenue were blocked. Iran's currency plunged. The rest of the signatories, France, Germany, the UK, disagreed, but Washington's grip on the dollar-based financial system meant global companies still complied with US demands. Here's the legal dilemma. Can a country impose sanctions that have extraterritorial effects? In other words, can the US punish a German company for trading with Iran just because that transaction passes through a US server or uses dollars? Technically, yes, under US domestic law. But in international law, it's murky. These kinds of sanctions often violate the principle of non-intervention and the sovereign equality of states. Yet enforcement prevails because of financial leverage, not legal consensus. Let's zoom out. Sanctions come in many forms. Economic sanctions like trade embargoes, diplomatic sanctions like expelling ambassadors, and military sanctions like arms embargoes. Some are comprehensive, like those imposed on North Korea, restricting nearly all trade. Others are targeted, like freezing the assets of Russian oligarchs following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. But here's the twist: legality often depends on who you ask. When the UN Security Council imposes sanctions, there's a broad consensus under international law. But when individual countries like the US or EU act alone, these are known as unilateral or autonomous sanctions. Critics argue these lack legal basis unless authorized by the UN or in self-defense. Take Cuba, for instance. The US embargo began in 1960 and continues to this day. Over 60 years later, it's one of the longest standing sanctions regimes in history. Every year since 1992, the UN General Assembly has passed resolutions calling for the embargo to end. In 2023, the vote was 187-2, with only the US and Israel opposing, but General Assembly resolutions are non-binding. The embargo stands, so who enforces these laws? There's no world police for sanctions. Instead, countries use domestic laws and agencies like the US Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, to implement and prosecute violations. Banks get fined. Corporations retreat. Even humanitarian aid is sometimes blocked due to overcompliance. This creates a chilling effect. In 2024, Médecins Sans Frontières reported they could deliver essential cancer drugs to Syrian hospitals. Not because they were banned, but because Western banks refused to process payments. Fear of penalties overrode humanitarian needs. Now let's talk Russia. Since 2022, Western nations have imposed over 16,000 sanctions on Russia, the most comprehensive package in modern history. Oil price caps, swift payment bans, freezing of central bank reserves. Yet, as of April 2025, Moscow is still trading oil through India, China, and shadow fleets. This raises another legal issue: the role of third parties in sanction evasion. Is India breaking international law by buying Russian oil? Not under the UN framework, because these sanctions aren't UN backed. Again, enforcement becomes a question of influence, not universal rules. There's a pattern here. The legality of sanctions is less about written law and more about global power structures. When the US imposes sanctions, the world often complies because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. When the EU acts, market size matters. But when smaller countries impose sanctions, the ripple effect is minimal unless others follow. This power imbalance has led to growing calls for reform. In 2023, a group of global South nations, led by Brazil and South Africa, proposed a new legal framework at the UN. Their argument? Sanctions should require international consensus, avoid harming civilians, and include mandatory humanitarian exemptions. While the proposal gained support, it stalled due to opposition from permanent Security Council members, particularly the US and UK. Let's not forget China. As of 2025, Beijing has introduced its own anti-foreign sanctions law, targeting companies that comply with Western sanctions. It's a tit-for-tat strategy. If Apple leaves Russia due to US pressure, it risks being banned from Chinese contracts. This legal tug-of-war puts global companies in an impossible position. Damned if they do, damned if they don't. Sanctions then become more than legal tools. They're diplomatic messages. When Canada sanctioned Saudi officials over the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, Riyadh retaliated by recalling students, banning trade, and pulling investments. The message was clear. You criticize us, you pay. The question now is, where does this end? There's growing concern that overusing sanctions dilutes their impact. In 2024, a report by the Carnegie Endowment found that only 29% of sanctions achieved their stated goals over the past 2 decades. Worse, they often deepen authoritarianism. When regimes feel cornered, they crack down harder. Civilians suffer while elites adapt, moving money through crypto, offshore havens, or sympathetic allies. But there are success stories. South Africa in the 1980s. Global sanctions helped dismantle apartheid. Serbia in the 1990s. Sanctions pushed Milosevic to the negotiating table. Libya in the early 2000s. Gaddafi surrendered WMD programs under international pressure. These cases remind us, when used selectively, legally, and multilaterally, sanctions can be powerful. So what's the future? AI and big data are reshaping enforcement. In 2025, the EU launched SanctiNet, a real-time tracking system to detect sanction evasion through maritime routes and digital currencies. The US Treasury is piloting blockchain-based enforcement tools. The next decade could see automatic freezing of illicit transactions before they even clear. But even perfect enforcement can't solve the core issue, the legitimacy. If sanctions are seen as political weapons rather than legal tools, global trust erodes. Nations retaliate, alliances fracture, and in the worst case, like with Iran or North Korea, they double down on defiance. And that brings us back to the opening question. When is a sanction justice, and when is it coercion? The answer depends on your seat at the table. For Washington, it's about upholding order. For Moscow, it's economic warfare. For Caracas, it's collective punishment. For the average citizen caught in between, it's medicine they can't buy, jobs that vanish, futures frozen by forces far beyond their reach. So the next time you hear about sanctions in the news, don't just ask what they are, ask why, who, and how. Because in the world of international law, power often speaks louder than principle. If this deep dive helped you see the world differently, give it a like. Share your thoughts in the comments and make sure to subscribe for more insights into global affairs.